This is East Asia Tonight.
Good evening, I'm Atelian with tonight's top stories from East Asia. President Lee Jae Myung portrays a special relationship between South Korea and Vietnam as he seeks to deepen cooperation in tech and energy on a visit to Hanoi. Now, also on a diplomatic blitz, China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi in Cambodia ahead of visits to Thailand and Myanmar as Beijing looks to strengthen ties in Southeast Asia. Well, meantime, China both praises and denies involvement as Taiwan leader William Lai's Eswatini trip is scrapped after 3 African countries revoke flight permits without warning. Also, Beijing says the Middle East is at a critical juncture after President Donald Trump extended the U.S.-Iran ceasefire indefinitely, saying he is awaiting a unified proposal from Tehran. Also ahead, from marinades in Japan to pastries in South Korea, Canadian maple syrup is going global, but climate change is turning harvests into a gamble. The South Korean President Lee Jae Myung is meeting Vietnam's To Lam for summit talks in Hanoi, their second meeting in less than a year, and they are expected to broaden cooperation in strategic sectors, including nuclear energy and infrastructure. President Lee is visiting with a large business delegation, and they will be expected to pitch roles for Korean firms in Vietnam's state-led projects, including nuclear power and the Gia Binh Airport in northern Vietnam. Now, Seoul also seeking wider access for Korean cultural and agricultural products. At least a dozen government cooperation agreements could be signed, with both sides likely to reaffirm a goal of boosting bilateral trade to $150 billion by 2030. Well, for more on President Lee's state visit, we have with us CNA's senior correspondent Lim Yoon-suk live from Seoul. Yoon-suk, first let's talk about how Vietnam is becoming an increasingly important partner for Korea. Tell us what's driving this relationship and what's so significant about it at this time.
Well, Vietnam has become one of South Korea's most important partners in Southeast Asia, and it's really, driven mainly by this economic and demographic reasons. Now, this visit by Lee Jae Myung is very much focused on what many here are calling sales diplomacy, as he is expected to support South Korean companies in winning many of the major projects and expanding their role in Vietnam's development plans. Now, on the economic side, Vietnam is a major manufacturing base for South Korean companies now, especially in electronics, consumer goods, and increasingly parts of high-tech supply chains. Now, around 10,000 South Korean companies are operating in Vietnam right now, so there are already very strong business links between the two sides. Vietnam is also one of South Korea's top trading partners globally, which really shows how important the relationship has become in a relatively short period of time since diplomatic ties were established in 1992. Now, at the same time, Vietnam has a young population, a fast-growing economy, which makes it attractive for South Korea for future investment and consumption. And so, we're not just talking about production today, but also about long-term growth potential. There's also this strong people-to-people connection between the two countries. We have about 200,000 South Koreans in Vietnam now, making it the largest Korean community in Southeast Asia, and also a very large Vietnamese community here in South Korea, too. So all of that really creates this strong and social, business link between the two countries. And Vietnam, is also important to South Korea because it combines all of that, the strong manufacturing base, a fast-growing market, and a very deep economic and social presence of South Korean companies and citizens already there in Vietnam.
Yoon-suk, also walk us through the message that President Lee is sending through this Vietnam visit. And he's talked about focusing on future-oriented and strategic cooperation. I mean, what does that actually mean in practical terms? Well,
President Lee Jae Myung is trying to signal through this Vietnam visit that, this clear effort that he's trying to make is to upgrade the relationship that they have now from a traditional economic partnership into something more strategic and more future focused, more looking forward. Now, many analysts are saying that, when Lee Jae Myung talks about this future oriented and strategic cooperation, it's really talking about moving bilateral ties beyond this manufacturing trade that they have now into higher value sectors. Now, he was speaking to the South Korean community in Hanoi earlier, and he highlighted areas such as nuclear power, infrastructure development, and science and technology innovation. And these are, sectors, long-term sectors that require this deeper cooperation between governments, between companies, and not just simple investment or export deals. At the same time, he's also linking this cooperation to this broader global challenges such as supply chain stability, sustainable growth, and climate change response. And so the message is that South Korea and Vietnam are not only working together on businesses, trade, investment, but also on the bigger structural issues affecting the global economy. And it's also important to note, many analysts are saying that, this is being built on an already very strong foundation that the two countries already have. They're not just starting from zero, but what they do want to do is change the direction that they're heading, Vietnam being positioned not only as a production base, but as a long-term strategic partner in technology, infrastructure, and regional stability in Southeast Asia.
Well, thanks for helping us unpack South Korea-Vietnam relations. Just talking to CNA senior correspondent Lim Yun-suk, reporting to us live from Seoul. Now, China's top diplomat Wang Yi has arrived in Cambodia, the first stop on his Southeast Asia tour. Now, he and Defense Minister Dong Jun will hold their first 2+2 dialogue with their counterparts in Phnom Penh. Mr. Wang will also visit Thailand and Myanmar this week. And this comes as Beijing seeks to deepen ties in the region in the face of what it says are risks and challenges. And for more on this, let's turn to CNA's Crystal Chia, joining us live from Shanghai. So, Crystal, I'm curious to know, how has China framed this three-country Southeast Asian tour?
So China has said that it wants to strengthen ties in the face of what it calls increasing risks and challenges. It has called the three countries its friendly neighbors. As you said, Beijing has been expanding its ties in Southeast Asia. For instance, just last week, we saw Vietnamese President Tô visit China. That was his first overseas state visit since inauguration. So let's have a listen at how the Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry is framing Wang Yi's visit.
中方期待通过此访，推动落实高层共识，深化全面战略合作，夯实中柬铁杆友谊，丰富中泰一家亲内涵，弘扬中缅包波情谊，为各自国家人民带来更多福祉，为地区和平稳定与发展繁荣作出更大贡献。
Now, to note that this time last year, President Xi Jinping also made a very similar Southeast Asia tour, at that time to Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia. China has been actively positioning itself as a stable partner with policy certainty, especially in light of U.S. tariffs.
So, Crystal, tell us, what should we be looking out for with all these visits?
So let's zoom in on Cambodia, given that it was reported that Wang Yi had arrived this afternoon. So officials will hold the first meeting of the 2+2 strategic dialogue. That referring to foreign and defense ministers. It's reported that Chinese side will also meet other Cambodia officials. This includes meeting the deputy prime minister tomorrow to hold talks on advancing existing frameworks. Now, China has become an influential partner for Cambodia, its largest trading partner for 13 consecutive years. But of course, there are still points of friction. For instance, earlier this year, the Chinese embassy in Cambodia had pointed out that the disappearances of Chinese nationals in scam centers pose a major obstacle to ties.
Many thanks for that update. Crystal Chia speaking to us live from Shanghai. Time now for a short break, but coming up on East Asia tonight. SK Hynix is investing $13 billion in a new South Korean plant for advanced chip packaging, with construction kicking off this month. Plus, Chinese battery giant CATL's breakthroughs in charging time and driving range leave investors unimpressed. Hello again. Good to have your company on East Asia tonight. And it is now time to get you up to speed in business with Olivia Marzuki. So, Olivia, today, oil swings and fresh attacks in the Strait of Hormuz. Apparently, that's keeping markets on edge.
That's right, I'll tell you. So, oil price fluctuations driving sentiment in Asia today. And so, Brent crude seeing volatile swings throughout the session, hovering near $100 a barrel, and WTI at $90 a barrel. That's following reports of container ships leaving Iran coming under gunfire and stopped in water. Investors are still watching the fragile state of U.S.-Iran diplomacy after Trump extended the Iran ceasefire. But risk appetite in East Asia was steady. We see here Tokyo and Taipei finishing the day higher, about 0.7% for TAIEX. Kospi managed to eke out some gains after a choppy session, about 0.4%. The global oil shock, though, is now feeding into South Korea's factory gate inflation. Producer prices rose 1.6% on month in March, the sharpest monthly gain in 4 years. Soaring petroleum and chemical prices drove that increase. Producer prices are closely watched because they can feed through to consumer inflation. And China stocks edge up to a 3-month high led by AI and chip sectors. Both mainland indices ending the day in the green for Shanghai and Shenzhen, 0.5% stronger for Shanghai, 1.3% firmer for Shenzhen. Hang Seng, though, minus 1.2% in the red. China's finance ministry also auctioning off its largest stock of yuan-denominated sovereign bonds in Hong Kong since 2023, drawing record low yields for its 2-year and 15-year notes. And that's as Beijing ramps up efforts to boost the yuan as a global currency. Japan's exports rising for a 7th straight month, led by demand tied to AI, blunting the impact of trade disruptions caused by the Middle East conflict. Japan's boosted by strong demand for its semiconductor exports. Total overseas shipments by value rose 11.7%. That's on a year-on-year basis in March. Imports grew nearly 11%. It recorded a trade surplus of $4.18 billion, smaller than market forecast. Japan is feeling mixed effects from disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, higher oil prices boosting export values, but also raising costs for businesses and households. Manufacturers are growing concerned with shortages of key materials such as naphtha, forcing dozens of firms to halt orders. The economy is still showing modest recovery, supported by investment and resilient export, but momentum remains uneven. Analysts warn that rising energy costs could squeeze growth in a country heavily reliant on imports. The Bank of Japan is expected to hold interest rates steady next week as it navigates inflation pressures from a weak yen and higher oil prices. South Korean chipmaker SK Hynix is doubling down on the AI boom with plans to invest 19 trillion won, that's about $13 billion, in a new advanced packaging plant. Construction is set to begin this month. The facility will focus on advanced packaging, a key step in producing high bandwidth memory or HBM chips widely used in AI servers. SK Hynix plans to complete the wafer testing lines by October next year and wafer-level packaging lines by February 2028. SK Hynix is already one of the world's largest memory chip makers and supplies advanced chips to NVIDIA. Earlier this year, it said it would speed up expansion plans, including bringing forward the opening of another plant in South Korea. Its latest investment underscores how chipmakers are scrambling to add capacity as AI demand continues to surge. CATL shares lost power despite major battery upgrades, even as the stock remains up 166% since its listing last May. One of the world's largest EV battery makers launched its integrated supercharging and battery swapping network.
从10%冲到98%，神行超充第三代只需要6分27秒。即便在零下30摄氏度的极寒环境里，从20%冲到98%，我们神行第三代也只需要仅仅9分钟，不到10分钟的时间。
CATL also displaying its new Qilin battery, which it says had a maximum range of 1,500 kilometers on a single charge. That is up from the previous limit of 1,000 kilometers. CATL is locked in stiff competition with BYD, with both companies pouring in billions of dollars into research and development. The two firms produce more than half of the world's EV batteries and are a critical source of power in boosting China's dominance in the energy storage sector. And it is a sweet symbol of Canada. But maple syrup is winning fans far beyond North America. Demand is rising in Asia, used as sweeteners, and in Japanese marinades as well as South Korean pastries. Now, it is also making its way into Southeast Asian desserts like pandan cakes. But for producers, climate change is making harvests increasingly unpredictable. Karina Huber reports from the sugar shacks of Quebec.
Friends and family gather at a sugar shack in Quebec, rolling fresh maple syrup onto snow, letting it harden before enjoying the sweet treat on a stick. It's a cherished spring tradition. For 6 to 8 weeks between March and April, maple farms across the province open their doors, inviting visitors to taste the season's first harvest. For many, 2026 has been a strong year.
You know, we've had monster runs. It comes and it almost overwhelms you. It's a little hard on the nerves.
For producers like David Hall, maple syrup runs in the family. Generations have worked these trees. While technology has boosted production, one factor remains beyond control: Mother Nature. In 2023, severe weather dealt a major blow to Quebec's maple syrup industry. That year, the province produced roughly 35 million liters of maple syrup. That's down 41% from a year earlier. By 2024, yields had almost doubled, with output hitting a record high of 68 million liters. Climate change is making weather increasingly unpredictable, disrupting sap flow. The ideal conditions for producing maple syrup are precise: freezing temperatures at night, followed by warmer daytime temperatures to get the sap flowing.
The Canadian maple syrup industry accounts for roughly 75% of global supply, with the vast majority of the maple farms found right here in the province of Quebec. The bulk of the sweet stuff is sent to the United States and Europe, but demand is growing in Asia.
Market research firm Stat Ledger reports the Asia-Pacific region accounts for just 8 to 10% of Canadian exports. But sales are climbing fast, increasing more than 7% year over year in countries like Japan and South Korea. The Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers, which represents 14,000 producers, says Japan is its top Asian market. The secret ingredient to that demand? Catering to local tastes.
It's important for us to find a fit with the Japanese culture, because I mean, who better than a Japanese chef to tell us how to use maple syrup? So that's what we're trying to do. So we do partnerships with local chefs and different things to make sure that maple is included, I'd say, in the right way in the Japanese culture.
Marino says the surge in demand is driven by a global shift toward natural sweeteners and premium food products. Retailing for between $14 and $18 per liter, maple syrup is often called liquid gold. Its value is so significant, Canada maintains a strategic reserve, sometimes dubbed the OPEC of maple syrup. When production falls short, syrup is released from the reserve to meet demand and stabilize prices. In stronger years, stocks are replenished. But with demand surging, reserves are being tapped even as supply remains tight. Despite concerns about climate change and rising demand, producers here say there's room to grow.
we're lucky because in Quebec we have a lot of space up north also, and a lot of forests that are untouched and ready for production. So we're ready for the coming years.
From the forests of Quebec to tables across Asia, this centuries-old tradition is expanding far beyond its roots, even as the changing climate keeps producers guessing one drop at a time. Karina Huber, CNA, Montérégie, Quebec.
So there you go, Tilly, a bit of a sweet story to wrap up the business news for today.
You're always so considerate and thoughtful. Thanks very much for that, Olivia. Well, on that note, moving on to our next story about Singapore's Coordinating Minister for Social Policies, Wang Yi. Well, he has called for better awareness on how technology will affect social governance. He was speaking after wrapping up a 2-day visit to Hangzhou, leading an official delegation at a forum on social governance with Chinese counterparts. CNA's Tan Yu-Guan with a report.
A packed program took the Singapore delegation out of Hangzhou into Zhejiang's smaller towns. There, they were given a closer look at how issues are handled at the grassroots. In just one day and over 250 kilometers, the Singapore delegation moved from small-town mediation halls to Hangzhou's AI-powered city brain, witnessing how governance here works at different levels, from resolving disputes within small township communities to anticipating problems in a massive city like Hangzhou, which has twice as many people as Singapore. Officials here say the aim is to deal with problems early, keeping them from escalating. Just one of few things that found resonance among the Singapore delegation.
I think we operate on a similar philosophy. What is somewhat interesting is during my 2 days of meeting, there is so many instances where my counterparts mention the need for rule of law. Yeah. And for us as a country that was founded on the rule of law, it's quite interesting.
Mr. Ong met with Chen Wenqing, a member of the Politburo, China's highest governing body. For Mr. Ong, this is also his second visit to China this year, and a trend has caught his eye.
The very bold and widespread adoption of AI use cases and tech use cases. In Singapore, we are a little bit more circumspect. We study it, make sure it's safe, make sure people can accept, then we roll it out to the whole system. Yeah, it operates on a different logic, but it's interesting to see the development and to monitor the development.
The Singapore delegation attended the 5th China-Singapore Social Governance Forum, with both sides sharing their experiences in building cohesive and stable communities. And as far as their effort is concerned, Mr. Ong sees digital technology as a double-edged sword.
It changes humans' relationship quite profoundly, People are just spending less time interacting, and over time, it can also affect community cohesion. And with less mutual respect, understanding, and knowing each other, you can create more misunderstandings and therefore more disputes. And therefore, social governance have to come in.
About 60 delegates from Singapore and China took part in the forum. Tan Yu-Guan, CNA, Hangzhou, China.
Coming up on East Asia tonight, China praises African nations and denies accusations of coercion after Taiwan says that pressure from Beijing prompted its president to cancel a planned trip to Eswatini. Our correspondent in Taipei with all the details. Plus, China warns the Middle East is now at a critical juncture after U.S. President Donald Trump extended a ceasefire with Iran indefinitely, giving Tehran more time to deliver a unified proposal. This is East Asia Tonight, and here are the headlines we're following. South Korean President Lee Jae Myung meets Vietnamese leader To Lam in Hanoi on a state visit to boost bilateral ties. Seoul seeks to expand cooperation with Hanoi in areas including nuclear energy, infrastructure, and advanced technologies. China's top diplomat Wang Yi is in Southeast Asia on a 5-day tour, visiting Cambodia, Thailand, and Myanmar. Beijing says the visits are aimed at deepening ties and boosting regional stability amid rising risks and challenges. Plus, China praises African nations for denying overflight access to Taiwanese President William Lai. Taipei says pressure from Beijing forced a planned trip to ally Eswatini to be scrapped. The African nation has expressed its regret over the cancellation. China's Taiwan Affairs Office says that it appreciates 3 African nations for supporting the One China principle after they withdrew overflight permissions, preventing the Taiwan president from transiting their airspace. Well, separately, the Foreign Affairs Ministry rejected Mr. Lai's status as president, warning countries against any attempt to legitimize the self-ruled island. Mr. Lai's office earlier accused Beijing of pressuring the Seychelles, Mauritius and Madagascar into withdrawing their permissions, forcing the Taiwanese leader to cancel his trip to Eswatini.
这种在国际间呢绝无仅有，以胁迫的手段威逼第三国改变其主权决定的行为，不仅冲击飞航的安全，违反了国际相关规范及惯例。 更是对他国内政公然的干预，破坏区域的现状，更伤害了台湾人民的感情。
Madagascar and the Seychelles say they impose the restrictions as they do not recognize Taiwan. Eswatini says the cancellation does not affect its long-standing ties with the island. Now, it is the first case of a Taiwan president cancelling a foreign trip due to aviation restrictions from a lack of diplomatic ties. William Lai responded, saying the island must show a, quote, spirit of fearlessness in the face of China's suppression. For more, we've got CNA senior correspondent Victoria Jen joining us live from Taipei. Vic, what's been a reaction in Taiwan to President William Lai's cancelled trip?
Well, the reaction here has been quite divided, and it really reflects Taiwan's political landscape. The presidential office and the ruling DPP are putting the blame squarely on Beijing, calling the move a form of coercion and a violation of international norms. The DPP is going even further, accusing China of brutally interfering in others' internal affairs and trying to squeeze Taiwan's diplomatic space. Now, the opposition is taking a different tone. The KMT says it regrets the cancellation, but is also questioning whether the government did enough preparation. They're basically saying if this was such an important trip, there should have been a better risk assessment to avoid this kind of last-minute disruption. The Taiwan People's Party is somewhere in between. It also criticized Beijing's pressure, saying it only raises tensions, but at the same time is questioning whether the government has been too optimistic about its international support. As for public sentiment, it's quite mixed. Some people see this as clear political pressure from China and feel Taiwan should stand firm and push back. But others are focusing more on the practical side, asking whether the government could have handled this better, especially when it comes to planning and managing diplomatic risks. So this is not just about diplomatic issue, but a domestic political debate about how Taiwan should respond to pressure from China.
And of course, there is a stark difference in how Beijing treats the DPP and the KMT. So, Victoria, how is that being viewed in Taiwan?
Yes, people here definitely notice that difference. Beijing has taken a much tougher line on President Lai and the DPP. It sees them as pro-independence, so you often see more pressure, whether it's military activity, diplomatic moves, or situations like this canceled trip. But when it comes to the KMT, Beijing is more open to engagement. There are still exchanges, visits, and communication channels between the two sides. Now, in Taiwan, this is interpreted very differently. The DPP says this shows China is trying to influence Taiwan's politics by isolating the ruling party and engaging the opposition. The KMT argues the opposite. It says this proves that dialogues works and that keeping communications open can help reduce tensions. For the public, it's not so black and white. Some see this as pressure Taiwan needs to resist. Others worry that without dialogue, tensions could get worse. So in the end, this difference in treatment is feeding into a bigger debate here, and that is how Taiwan should deal with China going forward. Natalie?
Right. Many thanks for that update on cross-strait relations. CNA senior correspondent Victoria Jen reporting to us live from Taipei. Right, now for some news in brief. China says a group of its naval vessels, including a destroyer, passed through a waterway between two islands administered by Japan's Okinawa prefecture. The vessel formation was returning home through the waterway after testing far seas capabilities. While international vessels can use the route, Japan says it can act if ships enter its territorial waters, defined as 22 kilometers from its shoreline. Now, the passage comes amid heightened tensions in the region, with both sides reporting naval movements in nearby disputed waters. Well, adding to those tensions, China has once again condemned Japanese Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi's offerings to the Yasukuni Shrine, along with visits by other officials. The shrine honors Japan's war dead, including those convicted of war crimes. Beijing says the actions, quote, trample on human conscience. The reaction follows China's earlier statements, calling the shrine a symbol of the wars of aggression launched by Japanese militarism. South Korea has returned the remains of a dozen Chinese soldiers killed in the Korean War at a joint ceremony with China this morning. It marks the 13th handover, with remains of 1,023 troops returned so far. The ceremony was held publicly for the first time in 3 years, in a sign of warming ties between the two countries. South Korea has vowed to continue its repatriation efforts going forward. China has warned that the Middle East is now at a critical juncture after U.S. President Donald Trump extended a ceasefire with Iran, giving Tehran more time to negotiate. But Washington has indefinitely extended the truce just hours before it was due to expire.
当前地区局势处于战和转换的关键阶段，当务之急仍是全力避免战端重启。中方支持相关方继续坚持通过政治外交途径化解争端，实现全面、持久停火止战，维护好中东和海湾地区和平稳定。中方愿根据习近平主席4点主张精神，同国际社会一道，为此发挥积极建设性作用。
President Trump earlier posted on his Truth social media platform that the ceasefire will hold until Tehran submits a truce proposal and the conclusion of negotiations. He says this is at the request of Pakistani mediators, given what he's calling the fractured state of the Iranian government. Mr. Trump also claiming that Iran is, quote, collapsing financially under the U.S. blockade in the Strait of Hormuz, which he says will remain in place. But Iran appears skeptical. Tehran has repeatedly said that the American military must end its siege before negotiations can proceed. Pouring cold water, an advisor to Iran's lead negotiator, has called the U.S. ceasefire extension a ploy to buy time for a surprise strike. Now, UN Chief Antonio Guterres, through his spokesperson, has welcomed the extension, calling it an important step to build confidence between both sides. He urged against any violations of the ceasefire and called on both to resume talks. Singapore Foreign Affairs Minister Vivian Balakrishnan has addressed tensions in the Middle East. He was asked at an event if Iran's reported attempts to impose tolls on the Strait of Hormuz could set a precedent for key shipping lanes closer to home. Now, he said that countries in this region want waterways like the Straits of Malacca and Singapore open.
We don't have tolls. All of us are trade-dependent economies. All of us know it is in our interest to keep it open. Second, between the three of us, we have a cooperative mechanism. Not to collect tolls, but to keep it open and to maintain that position. The point here is that all three countries have a strategic interest and are strategically aligned in keeping it open. That's not something which you can take for granted in many other places.
Dr. Balakrishnan also spoke about his engagement with Iran. He has made a request to speak with his Iranian counterpart, but is giving him time amid the current situation.
But we do not agree to closure of the Strait of Hormuz because we do not agree that that should ever happen, even in our neighborhood, which is in fact even tighter than yours. You know that I will have to tell him. In fact, he already knows. I can't pay you any tolls. So it's not personal, it's a matter of principle. That's just the way Singapore operates.
And we've got more insights on the war on Iran in our website, cna.asia, or on our mobile app, including this commentary on how the current oil and gas supply shock due to the conflict compares with past disruptions. Coming up next on the bulletin, the ICC rules on former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte's appeal, challenging its jurisdiction over his crimes against humanity. Our correspondent unpacks the court's decision. The International Criminal Court has rejected all 4 of former Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte's appeals for release, ensuring the case will continue within the ICC. Now, ex-President Duterte's defense team had filed the appeals against the court, challenging its jurisdiction over his alleged crimes against humanity during the war on drugs period between 2011 and 2019. Now, Duterte is accused of widespread and systemic attacks against Philippine civilians that resulted in the deaths of thousands in extrajudicial killings. And for more, let's turn to William Denslow. He's been tracking the latest developments for CNA, and he joins us live from Brussels. So, William, perhaps first up, if you could just break down how the ICC ruled in Duterte's jurisdiction appeal trial.
Well, Telly, if you think we might have been here before when it comes to this ICC process, in some ways we have. We know that last October, a pre-trial group of judges rejected these grounds for these appeal grounds on the basis of jurisdiction, whether the ICC effectively had the right to accuse Mr. Duterte of these charges that he faces, these 3 counts of murder, of crimes against humanity that he's alleged of committing during that war on drugs. But a different panel at the ICC has ruled again against Duterte's defense team. You mentioned those 4 counts. Not all of them were unanimous, but all effectively rejecting his bid. This was really seen as the last potential roadblock in this case going to trial. So certainly a significant announcement coming out of The Hague, and this rejection of Mr. Duterte's grounds for whether the ICC had jurisdiction on this matter.
Right, and as you've mentioned, Will, it feels like we have been here before. So I have to ask you this question again, a question that I asked you before as well. What are the next steps for the former president?
Oh, Telly, this really was seen as significant. The key question and a key line that we've seen from Mr. Duterte's defense team was the fact that the Philippines pulled out of the ICC, withdrawing from the Rome Statute back in 2019. They argue that that means that this world court doesn't have jurisdiction to go after the former president. But what we're hearing again from the judges is that essentially, oh, yes, they do. They say that the alleged crimes were committed during this period of 2011 to 2019, when the Philippines was still very much a part of the Rome Statute. That is why they say there are still these grounds to proceed. Of course, we know that the defence team have also cited Mr. Duterte's health as a reason not to go forward with this trial. He is 81 years old. That has also been rejected. We know in February that the confirmation of the charges has been announced by the ICC. So really, the next step in this trial is, well, things can really begin in earnest, and the key questions can begin to be tackled, whether indeed Mr. Duterte committed these alleged crimes against humanity, these murder charges that he faces. He, of course, maintains his innocence in all of those counts that he faces.
Well, appreciate the update on Duterte's ICC ruling. Thanks so very much. William Denslow reporting for CNA from Brussels. Now, a year ago, maritime decarbonization ran on momentum and net zero ambition. Well, today, geopolitical shocks, regulatory uncertainty, and rising costs test that resolve. Well, earlier, my colleague Roland Lim spoke with Professor Lin Lu, CEO of the Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization, about what the tagline, "Actions Meet Ambition," really means, and why the next phase of decarbonization is less about promises and more about execution.
Net zero is very much still a target. At the IMO, the GHG strategy remains, so the direction of travel remains. I think what's less certain is the pathway towards that target. So in fact, the conversations that are happening in London this week and next week is going to build towards coming to another vote on the net zero framework. So I think what this means, given all the headwinds that we're seeing right now, is decarbonization needs to be contextualized accordingly. I think 5 years ago, or even last year, we were very much talking about ambition. Now decarbonization needs to grow up. It needs to be more pragmatic. How do we think about decarbonization in the presence of all these other headwinds that are going on? It's still important to figure out the long term, so it's balancing the short-term shocks with a long-term ambition and a long-term goal, because the environment and protecting the environment, protecting the climate remains a very, very important priority.
Would it be fair to say that the International Maritime Organization has lost its grip on the net zero framework, simply because plans, policies, talks all have been delayed?
Well, I mean, I think one needs to look at what the International Maritime Organization was set up to do. The International Maritime Organization's original mandate and jurisdiction is really on the technical, navigational, and operational aspects of shipping. And so in that respect, if you look at the net zero framework, there is the fuel standard side of things, which is technical, and then there is the pricing mechanism. The fuel standard side of things is not controversial. I think the industry wants it. The industry recognizes that we need to decarbonize, and having a set of rules or guardrails that we can all follow allows investment decision to be made with certainty. So I think that piece is still being worked on, and the more refined we can provide answers to industry will have more confidence to move forward. I think the piece that is a little more controversial is the pricing mechanism, and unfortunately that piece has gotten politicized.
Right. Are we closer to solving that green premium, or is cost still the biggest factor when it comes to convincing people to decarbonize?
Well, cost is certainly a factor. Here we're talking about an energy transition, and energy transition is inherently inflationary. So the question is, how do we overcome this cost, whether there are opportunities to pass down the cost? At the Global Center for Maritime Decarbonization, we're looking at ways where we can look at decarbonization solutions today where it actually is good for business. So I'll give you a specific example. So energy efficiency technologies is something that we all recognize is good, because for every ton of fuel saved is money in your pocket. And perhaps even just before the war, a ton of fuel saved is $500-600 a ton. Today, it's $1,000 a ton. So, and it's the same energy efficiency measure that would be at work. So we're talking about wind sails, or we're talking about air lubrication technologies. And so we're looking at ways where we can give the industry additional confidence in adopting these different kinds of technologies.
Which alternative fuels are scaling up right now? I'm thinking biofuels, methanol, ammonia, even LNG.
So these different pathways all exist at different levels of maturity. I think if we're talking about right now, which is what you asked, Roland, what's available today at scale is biofuels, drop-in biofuels, because engines are available. You don't need to retrofit engines. So you can have biofuels be blended directly with marine fuel. We can do that. Of course, liquefied natural gas is something that's increasingly available, although that's still fossil today, and so it's not net zero. It certainly is lower in carbon intensity, but we would still need pathways to move beyond that. Ammonia and methanol are more in the horizon. Methanol shift certainly does exist, and there's some green, blue methanol that's in the market, but that certainly still needs to scale.
Now, the number of births in South Korea grew at a record pace in February, continuing an upward trend since 2024, driven by a post-pandemic boost and government policy. More than 22,000 babies were born during the month. That's 13.6% year-on increase, marking the highest pace of growth for any February since record-keeping started in 1981. Now, the peak in births nudged South Korea's total fertility rate up by 0.1 to 0.93. The nation, however, is still facing a demographic crisis, with a figure far below the 2.1 replacement level. But the uptick in births may not continue after the number of marriages in February dropped 4.2% on year to about 18,000. So this marks the first decline after 22 straight months of increase. Well, China has unveiled a new plan for its cities to integrate youth development into urban planning. It's part of a broader push to make urban life more supportive for young people, children, and families. The blueprint, jointly issued by 15 departments, aims to deepen the construction of, quote, youth development-oriented cities. Measures span jobs, housing, healthcare, education, and public services. The pivot comes as authorities shift their focus from rapid growth to improving quality of life and stable development, following years of breakneck urban growth that once supercharged the world's second-largest economy. Now, the move also aligns with efforts to reverse China's demographic decline, with Beijing declaring in March that it will build a childbirth-friendly society in 5 years. Official data showed China's population dropping in 2025 for a fourth straight year to 1.4 billion. Birth rate plunged to a record low, with the total number of births last year at nearly 8 million. Now, that's a 17% fall from 2024. A new report warns that extreme weather is becoming a growing threat to democracy. Stockholm-based Democracy and Electoral Assistance Institute International IDEA says that at least 26 elections and referendums were postponed due to natural disasters in the past 2 decades. Well, it says that 23 elections across 18 countries were disrupted by natural disasters in 2024 alone. According to the institute, extreme weather damaged infrastructure. It also displaced voters and forced last-minute changes to electoral processes. Now, the study also highlighted several case studies, including how severe flooding disrupted local elections in Indonesia in 2020. Now, the report was published to coincide with Earth Day, which happens to be today, and comes a day before 2 Indian states head to the polls. Well, voters in Tamil Nadu are battling an intense heat wave as they prepare to cast their ballots. Several cities in the state of West Bengal, too, are recording temperatures as high as 43 degrees Celsius. Well, a sneak peek into what's ahead on Asia tonight. Some stories that we'll also be covering include Indonesia considering taxing ships transiting the strategically vital Strait of Malacca, one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. Jakarta says the proposal aligns with President Prabowo Subianto's directive to position Indonesia as a central player in global trade, and that any levy will need to be coordinated with neighboring countries. Plus, Indonesia's stock exchange tightening its benchmark indexes as part of a broader push to reassure global investors. It says that companies with highly concentrated ownership will be removed from key gauges, with change to take effect after this month's review. We've got these stories and more on Asia tonight, 8 p.m. Singapore, Hong Kong time, right here on CNA. And that wraps up this Wednesday's edition of East Asia Tonight. Hope you've enjoyed it. Don't forget, if you need to catch up on headlines, go to cna.asia. And you can find us on most of our socials, including Facebook and YouTube. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you tomorrow. Good night.